Hello and welcome to another episode of the MiamiHal Real Estate Show, where we talk everything real estate and real estate related. And today I have an amazing guest who's going to walk us through the wonderful, scary, sometimes scary, topic of permits, and that is Paul Buckler. Paul Buckler is the building official for Pinecrest. And if you want to find a guy who knows everything about permits, Paul's one of those guys that can really walk through pretty much everything. And that's what we're going to do today, because I know some of you have questions that you're afraid to ask. So I'm going to ask them for you. Paul, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming here.
I appreciate your interest.
Absolutely. So I think we start with the basics. Why do I need a permit? Why does somebody that wants to do something to their home need a permit?
Well, it always goes back to the idea of protecting life safety and property values. And it comes from historic. You go back and you look at when there were no building codes and fires and that kind of property damage and loss of life. So incrementally, the codes came about.
There was a time in Miami-Dade County where you had to have two egresses, ways in and out of a apartment, where we saw some kind of strange construction, but it was a way to protect from people from fire, right? Because if one of the doors was near fire, you could get to the other one.
Yeah, I've seen those. Sometimes they were a foot apart.
Exactly, which seemed a little strange, but the code made sense. It's like, hey, if I can't get out this door, I got to have another way out, right?
Yeah, I think the problem is sometimes the codes address a scenario. And then what happens is like a software, when that's in the beta, when it goes into real use, all of a sudden all these other things come up that weren't anticipated. And I think what happened in those cases is usually condos or apartment buildings, which have a different distinction. And so they said, well, you need two means of egress for residential, which usually means a window to a bedroom. But if you're up 12 stories, at one point they said, well, I don't think that really qualifies.
Right.
So they had that thing, and then over time, the effectiveness of it was, lost, or buildings became sprinkled in the second egress, or the fact that you could go to a balcony and escape, came about. So the code evolves, but yeah, sometimes they don't necessarily make sense.
Right. So that's code, and that one did make sense because you want to, as you said, life safety. Right. You want to make sure people are safe even in conditions where there's fire. But building codes and permits that kind of help you get to successful levels of building to that code can vary very widely, I would say. So yeah, okay, if I have that life safety issue with having two egresses, that makes sense, right? But why would I need a permit to change a wall in my house? Just open up the kitchen. Why do I need that?
Well, yeah, I think most changes people start with the thing that it's an innocuous change, and why do I need to do it? It's my property. It's like, I don't know if the comparison's completely the same, but it's like when I'm in a hurry and speed limits are an inconvenience, well, I feel like I'm a safe driver, I'll go through. And the same thing, a lot of times people can do alterations and maybe it doesn't affect things down the road, but for the most part, that didn't happen in the past. And so to cover everybody, it's like I often get, people that say, I've had a store for 25 years and I've never had a handicapped person in my store. Why do I need to have handicapped egress? Or somebody goes, I don't have children. Why do I need a kiddie barrier on my pool? You can't cover every scenario, each person's individual scenario. So the code kind of does a blanket. And then what happens if, say, you do an improvement on your house and you're okay with it not being permitted, but then you sell it, and then the person who bought it might not have been okay with it not being permitted. So, and then unpermitted work gets into a lot of other things that title insurance can be affected if they find out you have unpermitted work. So in the end, it's better to get permitted, and get your work inspected and have a certain minimum standard, because the code is really a minimum standard. It isn't beyond or any sort of extra level. It's really just a minimum requirement.
So we talk about permits, and you're saying that it's the minimum requirement for life safety, right? That's really what the core purpose is, or am I missing something?
For building, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So now we have a homeowner, and they're thinking about doing something in their home, and they truly don't know if that particular job needs permitting. For example, I want to change out these old carpets, and I want to put in some kind of tile floor. Do they need a permit?
Not based on that information.
Okay, yeah.
If it involves resetting toilets, going into the bathroom, then it does involve it. But for the most part, changing out flooring, finishes do not affect or require a permit.
And I think there's really a sense of confusion among some people as to, what, not that they need or don't need permits, but what needs a permit. And you kind of alluded to the fact, hey, if it's just the floor, not a big deal. We don't need permits there. But as soon as it touches, I'm kind of putting words in your mouth, plumbing, electric,
Right.
structural, then we have something that needs permitting, correct?
Right. We get calls all the time where people call and say, I'm doing this. Sometimes there's a tail to it. They go, I'm just changing my doorknobs and adding an addition.
Yeah.
So do I need a permit? It's kind of
Yeah.
like that. It's hard sometimes to get the full scope of work. Like little kids, they hear the first part of the answer, not the entire answer.
Right.
But, Pinecrest is really good. We're very accessible, and people call all the time. And we even make ourselves, if something is gray or they have a question, we'll send the inspector out to look at it with them and help them decide what their next move is.
Yeah. I want to talk about this briefly because some people that know something needs a permit, they try not to do it with permits because they see it as a big cost. And I think there's also a misnomer about what those fees to get a permit opened and closed really are about. They're not about, in your case, Pinecrest making money, is it?
Well, no. Pretty much the idea of permit fees is to cover the cost of the building department enforcing, so we don't operate at a profit. Because it's based on construction, depending on the amount of construction in a year, the income from permit fees can fluctuate. But the whole idea of permit fees is just to cover the inspectors and the administrative cost of it.
That's the part I wanted to kind of emphasize. So when you open a permit, you're essentially, as a homeowner, you're asking the city that you're in to say, hey, would you please check on this contractor's work or my work and make sure that it meets the requirements that I need to meet, correct?
Right.
And
Well,
so you have to put people on the street in order to do that, right?
Right.
Okay.
And one of the things is the requirements for inspectors or plan reviewers. It requires education or certification. It's just not a job you walk in and start doing the next day. So you have to, for people that are qualified, you need to pay.
Right. So you as a homeowner are paying your fair share of that person's time, who may be an architect or an engineer or whatever, to come out and say, yes, this job is being done to the proper standards. And when it's completed, to close that permit saying you have a job that was done the right way, correct?
That's the basic concept, yeah.
Okay. You want to give me any more detail that we should know?
No, I think sometimes people confuse the inspection process with like a quality control. Something can be installed, say, to the code, but it may have aesthetic problems. We're not there to enforce that. It's an interesting thing where there's sort of a sliding scale on people's opinions about building inspectors. They're an inconvenience. Sometimes, other times, people want to use them as a cudgel against their contractor
Yes,
to
they do.
get something,
Sure.
accomplished. So it goes back and forth. When things are good and nothing's wrong, they say, "Oh, why did I bother?" But then when something goes wrong, then they're like, "Well, why didn't the inspector call this?" And so you didn't call inspections. And my experience is that a lot of times the misunderstanding occurs somewhere in the middle. People will contract with a company to do some work, and the company may tell them that they've gotten a permit or not. And then something happens, and then they call and they complain that the inspector didn't do anything, and then we look and we go, we don't see a permit for that. So,
You just walked me right into my next question,
Okay.
which is when you have a project that you want to do at the house and you know you're going to be in need of some permits, should you as the homeowner open those permits, or should you allow the contractor that you're hiring? Do you have an opinion on that? I know there's not necessarily a rule, but what's your opinion on that?
well, there are, the code really only allows you to pull owner-builder permit on your property that's homesteaded. So if you own 9 properties, you can't pull owner-builder on all those properties.
Okay.
The code just allows you to do it on your personal property, and then it restricts you for the most part from doing the trades like mechanical, plumbing, electrical, because those require. And most people, especially in Pinecrest, don't get out with a shovel and start digging their own foundation. The problem of pulling owner-builder is people sometimes underlook the liability. Your homeowner's insurance, if someone gets injured on your property doing work and you're the owner-builder, your homeowner's insurance, as far as I understand it, will not cover that. Now, you can pull a special policy for coverage in that case, but the one thing about if you have a general contractor and somebody falls off the roof, it's the general contractor's problem, not yours.
You just made me start sweating because several years ago I had worked on, not in Pinecrest, but in another village nearby, and I did owner-builder permits, and now I didn't realize that I had that liability the entire time that project was live.
Yeah, a lot of people don't, or, I think in general we always think things will go along without a hitch. And a lot of people are usually not, the first time people think that contractors are sort of just getting extra money that they don't have. Usually people, after they do a project, owner builder, hire a contractor the next time because they realize there is a lot covered by what a contractor does.
Right.
That said, a simple project, or you can do yourself. You just have to realize you have some liability, some exposure.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like your general advice is if you're hiring a contractor, let the contractor pull the permits and close those permits, correct?
Right. Well, that's
Now-
another thing too. A lot of times
Yeah.
you get a contractor pulls the permits, he gets the inspections, but he doesn't call for final.
Aha.
He
that's
collects his
my
money,
next question.
and then the next thing, a few years later, you find out you have a lien or you have a notice saying, hey, you have an expired permit.
Right. So to avoid that, what's your advice to a homeowner who does hire a contractor? The contractor is supposed to be pulling and closing permits. What do you tell the homeowner to do to help prevent situations like that?
What's the same thing you would tell somebody? Be more informed. Not like we mentioned earlier, is that municipalities are different. Pinecrest has I think like a somewhat 68, 69% higher education, and they're very engaged, so they're less likely to unknowingly not know about permits and the process. Still, things happen. But and then Pinecrest isn't required to, or by the code, but they'll send notices saying your permit is going to expire, so people do have an opportunity to follow up.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to get into the problems that I see as a result of things that have happened in the past. Because I'm a real estate agent, and both buyers and sellers often run into permit-related issues as they're trying to sell or purchase a home. The big one is Hurricane Andrew. And it's still, even though it's 30 years ago, it still comes up and rears its ugly head. It's almost like that disaster is still reoccurring.
Right.
And a lot of that has to do with, and I'm hoping you can add some real color to this. At the time, Miami-Dade County, everything was Miami-Dade County, and there weren't incorporated areas. So what we saw was a lot of people needing to do construction or renovations or repairs, and they completely overwhelmed, quote unquote, the system, right? Somebody might have really wanted to pull permits and they got no answer.
Right.
So they started their work, and maybe they got permits halfway through and tried to get it done right. Let's get it done and be done with this. And so there's a lot of stuff that was swept under the rug those 30 years ago. And to exacerbate the issue, there are incorporated areas now like Pinecrest in 1996 and Palmetto Bay and Cutler Bay, just to name a few, that have all incorporated. So when somebody discovers a permit that is still open or not closed or whatever, expired and not completed, nobody knows where to go. And in real life, there's just people pointing fingers in various directions. Can you talk to me in general about that? And then I'll give you a couple of real world examples that I'm trying to get some answers about.
Well, there's a lot to unpackage there.
Yes.
People that did work without a permit, that, tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, that may manifest itself somewhere down the line as far as if the work was, but that's outside the issue of these open permits. What I found is more anecdotal than is for a large period of time, they were just forgotten. And then as part of closings, the attorneys would uncover. And I guess there's an issue in title insurance about having open permits. It's not the building department, but it's like anything. It's an open permit. It's still there. So they created a system for places like Pinecrest where you could open a permit as an owner builder and close it with either an affidavit by an architect or an engineer, or the village would do the inspection. The problem is, for the most part, construction work would be concealed, so the village isn't going to do forensic work or make a decision based on work they can't see, so they deferred it to engineers and architects to do it. And then what has happened, though, is over time, well, the number of permits that are in that category have diminished. Homes have been torn down, so they go away. Roofs have been replaced, so they're administratively closed. So you're really getting down to fewer and fewer permits that are open. And then again, building departments don't pursue them. Usually it's somebody shows up at the 11th hour, their closings in 24, 48 hours, and they've uncovered 25 open permits. A lot of them are from that window of Andrew, some are later, and again, it gets that thing where a contractor started a project, finished it, and walked away. Pools are notorious for that. Once they got the green light that they could essentially finish, and the only thing left in the permitting process was to get the finals, that didn't happen.
They were gone.
Right.
No.
So.
Okay, so I know you're saying the problems stemming from Hurricane Andrew are diminishing simply because things are torn down, they're renovated again. We have second and third roofs even since Andrew, so no big deal. But for the few people that end up with a open permit, that in order for the property to close, they must close that permit first.
Right.
And they go to Pinecrest, for example. I'm going to change it a little bit because I know this is a real world. They go to Palmetto Bay and they say, listen, I've got this permit open, and it happened in 1993, early 1993, and I need you to help me close it. And Palmetto Bay's answer, to a degree, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, is that's not our issue. We don't handle permits that go back that far, and you need to go to the county to close that. I know. See, I
doesn't
see
jibe with what my experience.
Okay, I'm
what
seeing
they
your facial expression. I'm telling you, this happens more than once. I've had this happen, where the municipality will say that's not us. That happened back before we were incorporated, and if you want to close that, you need to go to the county level, and then I'll call or go down to the county for that particular homeowner and assist them. And the answer I typically get is, don't worry about it. It's not actionable.
Well,
what do we do?
There's a lot. Again, the issue usually comes up with the closing attorneys and the idea of not having open permits on a property. You can close on a property. The building department doesn't hold it up because of open expired permits. If anything, it just gets passed on to the next future owner.
There's the rub.
So that's between the buyer and the seller and and their attorneys, what they're willing to accept.
Right.
If that's your experience, it's inaccurate, because part of the thing is when these Pinecrest and these cities broke off, the permits were transferred to them.
Right.
So if you go online, it says essentially. Go to Pinecrest.
Exactly. So I'm going to have you talk specifically about Pinecrest because you really can't talk authoritatively about any other municipality. But in Pinecrest, you've got a little history in Pinecrest, right? How long have you been working in the
22
village?
years.
Okay. So you've got a lot of history there.
Right.
And you became the building official when?
6 years ago.
Okay.
Well, no, I'm in my first year as building official. I was assistant building official for a few years.
So many years. When somebody runs into a situation like I just described, if they come to Pinecrest, what does Pinecrest do for them?
Well, first we'll look at the burglar alarms. That's another one.
Great, let's hit it.
And we go, don't care, and then we close it administratively.
Okay. Is there a cost involved in that?
What?
Is there a cost involved in
No.
an administrative close?
An administrative one, there's no cost.
Okay.
That we cover that. Then if you have one like a pool, pools have a life safety aspect to
Sure.
it. I mean, there was a House bill a few years ago that, again, it was sort of one of those oracle kind of proclamations that said, permits that are open over 6 years kind of go away.
I have that written down. We're hitting all the things I wanted to ask. Go ahead.
Unless there's a life safety aspect to it.
Okay.
And so then it falls back to us. But a lot of things are life safety, even if sometimes not obvious, like fence, that it becomes, an aspect of a pool barrier or pool, is it grounded? And I've done a lot of these inspections, and there's things like screen enclosure. Well, I would bet 90% of the screen enclosures they're supposed to be grounded when there were certain parameters are met, like the proximity to the water. But over the years, the landscape people break the
Cable,
the ground,
Yeah.
and so they're ungrounded, and that's a safety thing.
Sure.
So what happens is when people do these and have someone come out and inspect it, they fix it, and then everybody's for the better. The fee's nominal. They don't. There's no penalty charge. It's really just the minimum administrative fee for processing it.
Got it.
And so.
So if somebody has, again, a larger permit that wasn't closed and Pinecrest has taken on the responsibility once they were incorporated, and somebody comes down and says, I need to close, I'll say it's a roof permit, okay? No, what does Pinecrest do? What guidance do they give them in order for them to allow closing of that permit?
Well, in case of a roof, it's the same thing. There's work that's concealed, the fasteners and the spacing and all that. So they allow them the opportunity to get a third-party engineer or architect, and there's a lot of companies that offer that service. And they'll go out and they'll do whatever they deem necessary to feel comfortable signing off on it. But again, it goes back to, a 30-year-old roof. You should be changing it soon.
That's true.
Even the best roof it has a lifespan. So the issue, I think, is going to continue to decrease. I was thinking about it. When I first started, it was more common.
Sure.
And over time, it has become less and less common, at least in Pinecrest.
All right. So a different scenario. Somebody's living in a 5-bedroom, 3-bath home. But when you look at public record, it's a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home. And so the way that I would describe it, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of like the left hand of the government and the right hand of the government don't really talk to each other. There's a building department and there's a taxation department. And even though there may be permits that changed it from 4 to 5 bedrooms and the bathroom count changed, that may be all permitted, but it never made it over taxation to the tax department. And then the homeowner is afraid to go have any permits pulled, therefore inspected, because what happens if they find that I've got 5 bedrooms here? What would you give guidance?
That doesn't
for?
really come up like that, at least in Pinecrest. What happens sometimes are a realtor will put a house on multiple listings, recently renovated, but you could go and look, but there hasn't been a single permit pulled in Pinecrest since 1996. So there's a red flag there.
Okay, good.
I once wondered why, people come and go, oh, I got flagged for this work, but we did a search and there were no permit problems. If you don't pull a permit, nothing's going to show up. And then I said, well, why doesn't somebody offer a service where they would come out and look and say, this is all brand new, let me check, you don't have permits. Then that people would know, but somebody said, well, that would really put a real hamper on selling homes if you really pursued finding everything out that you do. It's just a certain part of the aspect of buying something. You have a certain leap of faith. So what we've done, and I got this from the building officials of some other municipalities, is if someone buys a house and when they do, they more or less buy the problem. So at that point, if we determine, well, they didn't do the problem, they just now own it.
They inherited it.
We work with them, and we waive fees for penalties. We waive penalties, you still have to pay, because you get into the whole thing about, well, this guy pulled the permit, paid his thing, got his inspections, and this guy, why do you give him a pass on it because it wasn't his fault? There's some issues there beyond the fact that just was the work done properly and all that. Surprisingly, a lot of times they do find things like ungrounded receptacles in the kitchens, things like that. So people are usually okay after the initial annoyance. So, but in Pinecrest, what we do is if someone comes in and it's identified as unpermitted work, and they're, they go, well, how do I fix it? We work with them, and they essentially come out where they would have come out had a permit had been pulled. And they always have, I guess, a civil recourse against the person that sold it. But we don't penalize them. If it's 5 years later and they still are, dragging on it, then they will get, incur the penalties. So we try to, encourage people to right the wrong and move on. And most people, that's why Pinecrest is different. It's a more affluent community, and the biggest complaint we ever get is about timing. It is not about our fees or about anything like that. It's just time, speed. So people come in and they go, how can I get this resolved, and how quickly? And they're not worried about paying $100 fine for it. So,
All right, forgive me because I'm going to look down at my sheet because I want to get this right.
okay.
There were a lot of lost records in the county. And from what I understand, from 1961 to 1972, everything was put on microfilm, and there was deterioration of that microfilm to the point that a lot of it was destroyed.
Oh, yeah. It's almost impossible to find it.
Okay, so if somebody had permitting done, and this is going back quite a bit now, and even if it was closed, there might be missing records to that. How does Pinecrest resolve that? I know that you can't speak more generically, but how would Pinecrest resolve something to a house that had work done way back then?
Well, again, something like that, we would rely on a design professional going in, and I feel comfortable that to a certain extent you can determine 1956 construction from
1990.
2022
Yeah,
construction,
sure.
and make a determination. And usually we look for things like, to make sure that the life safety is brought up. Sometimes people say, I haven't done any work, and you go, your air conditioner has a, 2019 manufacture date on it, so they, so I think there's ways to do it. And again, Pinecrest is different. I think we really try to be accommodating and just work on getting things into compliance rather than the punitive and charging people. And most people in Pinecrest get, good design professionals who come in and they fix things. And then most people that buy something in Pinecrest like that scenario are usually doing work anyway, so they just incorporate it into their project.
I'm going to make this as generic as possible.
Good.
Somebody has work done in their house, and either they don't know the origin or whether there were permits pulled, or they know that no permits were pulled. And now it's 2022, and they say, you know what, it's time to put impact windows here. Should they be afraid that when somebody comes in to open a permit and to do the inspections during the permitting process, that the inspector is going to look at other parts of their house and go, oh my gosh, that's not done right?
Well, in most part, you're not supposed to do that. You're not. You
See,
don't
I'm
go
dispelling
in
the myth. Thank
to
you.
look at the window and say, "Let me check your bathrooms."
Right.
We don't do that. As a practice, we don't, and as a you know, they keep busy enough that they don't have time to pursue it. You know, it's
So-
interesting. It's sort of tertiary. The thing is that most of the complaints about construction or unpermitted work are generated by public turning in
Yes, their neighbor.
their neighbors, and not by code enforcement driving around looking for things. I think people think, oh, it's like, you know, that we're driving around peeking through fences and things like that. They have enough time keeping up with, you know, I'm calling my neighbor. We're really good friends. Don't tell them, but I think they're doing their kitchen without a permit. So, you know, I think the building department really is busy enough with people pulling permits and people who come in to have unpermitted work. Our goal is to get them, you know, get it all legalized, and we all move on.
And beyond that, yes, you're trying to get them legalized, but the reason why you're trying to get them legalized is because you really want life safety to be properly supported. You want to make sure that people are safe in the structures they're living in, right?
Yeah, I think that's the general mantra of the whole building department thing. And then there's a lot of incentive on the homeowner's side to getting their work permitted, because down the road, this is more anecdotal, but insurance can come back. If you burn down your kitchen and the insurance company determines that it was unpermitted work, you may be out of luck. And there's a lot of scenarios like that where it's sort of an off-ramp for your coverage if they find out that the work was unpermitted or done by unlicensed or, you know, or uninspected. So there's a lot of things built in this modern society. It's not just one person looking after another person. There's a lot of mechanisms there.
Paul, you've given us an incredible 30 minutes of education. I appreciate that. Can I ask you for a couple of maybe bonus 1 minute?
Sure.
You drive through Pinecrest and you see these blue pipes coming out of the ground recently and dirt being dug up. Can you tell us a little bit about the water project and what's going on there and how people should connect to those services that are now available near them?
Well, that's Public Works,
but you have some general idea of what's going on there.
Yeah,
yes?
I think it's an interesting thing. For years, that was bugaboo. You know, somebody moved in, and again, it's not Pinecrest. The water department would say they had this really complex, you know, math thing of where you are, where the pipe is, what's the distance, you know, what's the capacity, and then they would go, you need to connect. So the guy at the end of the block had to bring the line down the whole street and provide laterals to every house. So everybody, you know, here would be waiting for this guy on the end.
Let the guy at the end
house.
spend all the money,
Right,
and we'll
so-
connect to the cheap stuff.
And then sometimes people, you know, say somebody would be building a house, and they would call and they'd say, why aren't they making him, you know, extend the water? Because we want to hook up. And they go, well, you know, the water department determined he didn't meet their criteria, and they would be mad at us. So Pinecrest, as far as I understand, finally, you know, decided to you know, spearhead this, and there's, you know, money's involved from outside agencies and things like that, and they're bringing it through. I think, though, you have a window of time when you can when you have to hook up. So you don't necessarily have to hook up the day it's available. Most people do want to do that.
Sure.
But we've had cases where the water is here, the guy's line is here, but the water department is taking 6 months to provide the meter. But most of that water project is outside of Pinecrest's hands.
Yeah, it is. And I'm sorry I opened the can of worms, but it was really informative nonetheless. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Paul Buckler, it is Pinecrest building official. And Paul, if they want to get in touch with you or the department, how do they do that?
Call the building department.
Call the building.
305-234-2121.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this. This is almost like an evergreen. I'm going to be able to show this to anybody for the next couple of years. They're going to know what they need to know about permits. And until next week, have a great week. Bye, Paul.